General Tadamaki Kurabayashi sat in the underground command bunker on Iwo Jima, his hands trembling as he pressed the radio transmitter to his ear. Outside, the earth shook with a violence he had never imagined possible. Dust rained from the concrete ceiling above him. His officers stood frozen, their faces pale in the flickering light of oil lamps. "They have turned the island into a sea of fire," Kurabayashi spoke into the radio, his voice barely steady. "Everything we built, gone in minutes. The American firepower is not what we were told. It is not what anyone prepared us for." The response crackled back from Tokyo, but Kurabayashi could barely hear it over the constant thunder above. Another explosion rocked the bunker, closer this time. He knew what was happening. Every fortification, every defensive position his men had spent months building, they were being systematically erased from existence. Lieutenant Tanaka burst through the bunker door, his uniform torn and covered in black volcanic ash. "Sir, the northern batteries, all destroyed. We counted over 200 ships on the horizon. The bombardment hasn't stopped for 3 hours." Kurabayashi closed his eyes. He had warned Imperial Command. He had sent letters explaining that the Americans possessed industrial might beyond comprehension. They had not listened. Now, 20,000 of his men were trapped on this 8-square-mile rock, and the firepower raining down on them was unlike anything in the history of warfare. "How many shells, Lieutenant?" Tanaka's voice broke. "We stopped counting at 15,000, sir. The spotters say the battleships are firing non-stop. One ship alone carries more ammunition than our entire defense force." The general walked to the crude map on the wall, marked with defensive positions that no longer existed. He had studied American tactics for years, read every report from Guadalcanal, from Tarawa, from Saipan. But reading reports and experiencing this technological nightmare were different universes entirely. Another massive explosion shook the bunker. Somewhere above them, men were dying, vaporized, buried alive, or driven mad by the relentless bombardment. And this was only the preparation. The actual invasion hadn't even begun. Kurabayashi picked up his pen and began writing another message to Tokyo, knowing it might be his last. "The Americans do not fight with courage alone," he wrote. "They fight with steel and fire in quantities that defy belief. Every soldier they send is backed by the output of 1,000 factories. We were told we would face men. Instead, we face an industrial machine that—" The lights went out. In the darkness, Kurabayashi heard Lieutenant Tanaka breathing heavily. "Sir, there's something else," Tanaka whispered. "The Americans have brought something new." The pilots who survived the morning reported seeing aircraft they've never encountered before. Faster, more powerful, and there are so many of them they block out the sun. Kurabayashi felt a chill despite the suffocating heat in the bunker. He had received intelligence about American production capabilities, but he had dismissed some of the numbers as propaganda. Now he realized his fatal mistake. If you're already gripped by this story, hit that subscribe button now, because what happens next changed how the world understood American military power forever. Make sure to like this video and share it with anyone who loves real history. But how did General Kurabayashi end up in this impossible situation? To understand that, we need to go back 14 months earlier to a very different time when Japanese commanders still believed they could win. 14 months earlier, General Kurabayashi stood in the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, surrounded by officers who spoke with absolute confidence about victory. Maps covered the walls, showing Japan's vast Pacific Empire stretching from the shores of Asia to tiny coral atolls thousands of miles away. "The Americans are soft," General Hideki Tojo declared, stabbing his finger at the map. "They have factories, yes, but they lack the warrior spirit. One Japanese soldier is worth 10 Americans." Kurabayashi remained silent, but his mind churned with doubt. He had lived in America years before the war. He had traveled from coast to coast, seen Detroit's automobile factories, watched ships being built in massive yards along both oceans. He had driven across endless highways, seen cities that stretched beyond the horizon. The America he remembered was anything but weak. "General Kurabayashi," Admiral Yamamoto addressed him directly. "You've been chosen to command the defense of Iwo Jima. It is a critical position. From there, American bombers can reach our homeland. You must hold that island at all costs. I accept this honor, Kurabayashi replied, bowing. But I must speak truthfully about what we face. The American industrial capacity is exaggerated by their propaganda. Another officer interrupted. Our intelligence shows they cannot possibly produce the numbers they claim. Kurabayashi bit his tongue. He had seen the intelligence reports, and they terrified him. American factories were producing 1 ship per day, 1 aircraft every 5 minutes, tanks, trucks, and weapons in numbers that seemed impossible. But questioning these assessments would be seen as defeatist, perhaps even treasonous. Later that evening, Kurabayashi sat alone in his quarters, writing a letter to his wife. I fear I am being sent to defend a place that cannot be defended, he wrote. Not because our soldiers lack courage, but because we face an enemy whose strength comes not from spirit, but from the power of their entire nation transformed into a war machine. He thought back to his time in America, remembering a visit to a Ford factory in 1928. He had watched in amazement as automobiles rolled off assembly lines with mechanical precision. The workers moved with practiced efficiency, each person performing their specialized task. The manager had told him they produced over 4,000 cars per day from that single factory. If they can do this with cars during peacetime, Kurabayashi had thought then, what could they do with weapons during war? Now, in 1944, he was about to find out. The next morning, Kurabayashi flew to Iwo Jima for the first time. The island was small, dominated by Mount Suribachi on its southern tip. Black volcanic sand covered the beaches. It looked like a desolate, worthless piece of rock, but its location made it priceless. American bombers flying from here could escort raids on Tokyo itself. We will turn this island into a fortress, Kurabayashi told his chief engineer, Major Yoshida. Underground. The Americans will own the sky, so we must own the earth beneath it. Over the following months, Japanese troops dug 11 miles of tunnels into the volcanic rock. They built pillboxes with interlocking fields of fire, hidden artillery positions, and underground barracks that could withstand bombing. Every cave was connected, every position reinforced. Kurabayashi drove his men relentlessly, knowing that preparation was their only chance. But even as they worked, disturbing reports arrived from other islands. Saipan had fallen in July, despite fierce resistance. The Americans had brought overwhelming firepower. Hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft. Japanese defenders who had vowed to fight to the last man were simply obliterated before they could engage. The American bombardment at Saipan lasted for days, Lieutenant Tanaka reported, reading from classified documents. Survivors said it was like being inside a volcano. They fired over 165,000 shells before the invasion even began. Kurabayashi studied the numbers. Each American battleship carried shells that weighed as much as a small car. They could fire them accurately from miles away, again and again, hour after hour. His own artillery pieces had perhaps 50 shells each, and once fired, there would be no resupply. We cannot win a battle of firepower, Kurabayashi told his officers. We must fight differently. We will stay hidden, strike only when certain, and make them pay for every foot of ground. Christmas 1944 arrived, and with it came new intelligence that made Kurabayashi's blood run cold. American reconnaissance planes were photographing Iwo Jima daily. The invasion was coming, probably within months, and the American force being assembled was larger than anything yet seen in the Pacific. How many ships? Kurabayashi asked his intelligence officer. At least 400, sir. Possibly more. 400 ships. Kurabayashi tried to imagine that many vessels gathered in one place. His entire defense force had access to perhaps a dozen supply ships total. The material imbalance was so extreme it seemed like a nightmare rather than military reality. On February 15, 1945, the nightmare became real. American ships appeared on the horizon. Not 400, but over 800. Kurabayashi stood at his observation post, watching through binoculars as the vast armada took position. The morning sun glinted off their steel hulls, stretching across the entire ocean as far as he could see. So many, Major Yoshida whispered beside him. How can there be so many? Kurabayashi lowered his binoculars and turned to face his officers. Their confidence from those Tokyo meetings had vanished, replaced by the stark terror of men who finally understood what American industrial power truly meant. "Gentlemen," Kurabayashi said quietly, "now we will learn what it means to face not just an army, but an entire civilization bent on our destruction." At dawn the next morning, the bombardment began, and with it, General Kurabayashi's worst fears were realized in ways even he had not imagined possible. The first salvo struck at exactly 7 a.m. Lieutenant Tanaka was eating breakfast in one of the underground mess halls when the world above exploded. The impact was so powerful that men were thrown from their seats. Rice bowls shattered against stone walls. Oil lamps swung wildly from the ceiling. "Positions!" Sergeant shouted, but there were no positions to man. Kurabayashi's orders were clear. Stay underground during the bombardment. Any soldier who went to the surface would simply die. Private James Morrison stood on the deck of the USS Nevada, loading shells into the massive 16-inch guns. He was 19 years old from a small town in Ohio, and this was his first major battle. The noise was so loud he had stuffed cotton in his ears, but it barely helped. "Load!" His gunnery sergeant screamed. "Fire!" The battleship lurched backward as the gun discharged. Morrison watched the shell arc through the morning sky, disappearing toward the dark island in the distance. Seconds later, a massive explosion bloomed on Iwo Jima's surface. "That's one for Cleveland," Morrison shouted, already loading the next shell. His crew had painted the names of American cities on their ammunition. This shell read Detroit. The next one said Boston. Every 30 seconds, another shell fired. And the Nevada was just one of 8 battleships arranged in a semicircle around the island. Behind them, cruisers added their own firepower. Destroyers darted closer to shore, hitting specific targets. The combined bombardment was beyond anything Morrison had imagined when he'd enlisted 2 years ago. "How long we gonna keep this up?" Morrison asked his sergeant during a brief pause. 3 days, kid. 3 solid days before the Marines even touch that beach. We're gonna pound that rock into dust. Back in the tunnels, General Kurabayashi moved from position to position, checking on his men. The bombardment had been going for 6 hours, and already the psychological toll was visible. Some soldiers sat with their hands over their ears, rocking back and forth. Others stared blankly at walls, their minds shutting down under the constant thunder. "Sir, we've lost all communication with the northern sector," Major Yoshida reported. "The radio cables have been severed. 3 observation posts have collapsed. We estimate 40 men buried alive." Kurabayashi nodded grimly. The Americans hadn't even landed yet, and he was already losing men. "What about our artillery?" "Hidden and intact. But sir, if we reveal their positions to fire back, the American spotters will locate them immediately. We'll lose them in minutes. Then we wait," Kurabayashi ordered. "Let them waste their ammunition on empty beaches. When their Marines come ashore, then we strike." But calling it waste was psychological self-defense. Kurabayashi knew the truth. The Americans had so much ammunition that waste was a meaningless concept. They could fire for 3 days straight and barely dent their supplies. On the second day of bombardment, something changed. Private Morrison and his crew heard a new sound, a different kind of explosion, deeper and more sustained. "Napalm," his sergeant explained, pointing toward the island. "They're burning out the caves with jellied gasoline. Anything that can burn will burn." Morrison watched as aircraft dropped canisters that exploded into walls of flame across Iwo Jima's surface. The black volcanic sand seemed to shimmer with heat. Even from miles offshore, he could smell the burning. Inside the tunnels, the temperature became unbearable. Kurabayashi's men stripped off their shirts, gasping for air. The ventilation shafts that fed oxygen into the underground complex were drawing in superheated air from the fires above. Some soldiers collapsed from heat exhaustion. "We're being cooked alive," Lieutenant Tanaka said, his face dripping with sweat. "Sir, we must do something. We must fight back." "And reveal our positions?" Kurabayashi replied harshly. "That is exactly what they want. The Americans are patient. They will burn, blast, and bombard until we break discipline and show ourselves. Then they will destroy us before the real battle even begins. He walked to one of the ventilation shafts and felt the hot air rushing through. His uniform was soaked with sweat. Around him, young men who had trained for months were suffering in darkness and heat, unable to fight back, unable even to see their enemy. This was not the honorable combat they had been promised. On the third day, the bombardment reached its crescendo. Every American ship fired simultaneously in a coordinated strike that lasted 4 hours. The island disappeared beneath smoke and flame. Explosive shells, armor-piercing rounds, napalm, and high-explosive rockets. Everything in the American arsenal was thrown at Iwo Jima. Colonel David Shoup observed from a command ship, marking targets on his map. He was a Marine officer who would lead some of the first waves ashore. He'd fought at Tarawa, where inadequate bombardment had cost American lives. This time, the Navy was taking no chances. "Think there'll be anything left alive?" asked a young lieutenant standing beside him. "There better not be," Shoup replied. "We've thrown more explosives at that island than were used in some entire wars. If any Japanese survive this, they've earned their reputation as the toughest soldiers on Earth." But survive they did. When the bombardment finally ceased on February 19th, General Kurabayashi emerged from the lower levels of his command bunker. The silence felt strange after 3 days of constant noise. His ears rang. His body ached from tension and lack of sleep. "Damage report," he ordered. Major Yoshida consulted hastily scribbled notes. "Surface fortifications. Completely destroyed. Northern artillery batteries. 70% destroyed. Underground complexes. Mostly intact. Casualties, approximately 900 dead or missing, mostly from cave collapses and heat. But sir, the main defensive positions survive. The men are ready." Kurabayashi climbed to an observation post that still functioned. Through the smoke and dust, he could see the American fleet. And now, approaching the shore, were the landing craft. Hundreds of them, tiny boats filled with Marines, coming in waves that seemed endless. "Gentlemen," Kurabayashi said to his officers, his voice steady despite the horror he felt, "the bombardment was merely their greeting. Now comes their real power. Remember everything you have seen these past 3 days and understand, this is what American firepower means. They have not sent us their best soldiers. They have sent us their machines." He turned from the observation slit and faced his exhausted, traumatized men. "When I was in America, I saw their factories. I saw their cities. I tried to warn our leaders, but they would not listen. One officer told me that spirit would overcome material. Now you know the truth. Spirit alone is not enough against an enemy who can turn an entire island into fire and still have ammunition to spare." Take a moment to like this video if you're learning something new about World War II that they didn't teach you in school. And drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from viewers around the world. What would you have done if you were in General Kurabayashi's position? Would you have tried to fight back during the bombardment, or stayed hidden like he ordered? Share your thoughts below. But the story gets even more intense. Because what the Japanese discovered once the Marines landed would shock them in ways the bombardment never could. The first wave of Marines hit the beach at 9 a.m. Sergeant Bill Hayes from Brooklyn led his squad out of the landing craft, his boots sinking deep into the black volcanic sand. It was like trying to run through thick mud. Every step was exhausting. "Move! Move!" officers shouted, but moving was nearly impossible. The sand shifted and collapsed under their weight. Men struggled forward, carrying heavy equipment, breathing hard. From his observation post, General Kurabayashi watched through binoculars. "Wait," he whispered to the artillery officer beside him. "Let them land. Let them think the bombardment killed us all." More landing craft arrived. Hundreds of Marines poured onto the beaches, forming up into units, pushing inland. They looked confused. There was no resistance. No machine gun fire. No artillery. Just empty, blasted landscape and difficult sand. "Now?" the artillery officer asked, his hand hovering over the firing command. "Not yet," Kurabayashi replied. His discipline was iron. More. Sergeant Hayes and his squad made it 50 yards inland before stopping to catch their breath. "This is too easy," he told his corporal, a kid from Texas named Danny Wright. "Where are they?" "Maybe the Navy got 'em all," Wright replied hopefully. 3 days of shelling. Maybe there's nobody left." That's when Kurabayashi gave the order. Fire. Hidden artillery positions erupted simultaneously. Mortar rounds fell among the packed Marines on the beach. Machine guns opened up from camouflaged pillboxes that had survived the bombardment. In seconds, the quiet beach became chaos. Hayes dove behind a small ridge, sand spraying around him. Wright fell beside him, clutching his arm where shrapnel had torn through. They were waiting. Wright screamed. "They let us land, and then—" An explosion cut off his words. Hayes looked back toward the water and saw carnage. Landing craft were taking direct hits. Marines were pinned down in the sand with no cover. Medical corpsmen were already running between wounded men. But then something happened that made Kurabayashi's heart sink. The American response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 3 minutes of his artillery opening fire, American ships offshore had located his gun positions. Naval shells began landing with precision, destroying his carefully hidden batteries one by one. "How?" Major Yoshida gasped. "How did they find us so fast?" "Spotting aircraft," Kurabayashi replied, pointing to small planes circling above. "Radio coordination. They have systems we cannot match. Every time we fire, they know exactly where we are." On the beach, Sergeant Hayes saw American tanks coming ashore. Sherman tanks fitted with flamethrowers. They moved slowly through the sand but steadily, targeting every Japanese position. When a pillbox was identified, the tanks approached and sent jets of flame into the openings. The screams of burning men carried across the beach. "Jesus," Wright muttered, his wound forgotten. "They're burning them alive." But Hayes was watching something else. The sheer volume of equipment coming ashore. More tanks. Artillery pieces. Trucks. Ammunition. Medical supplies. It was like watching an entire army materialize on the beach. Every few minutes, another landing craft arrived with more men, more equipment, more ammunition. By nightfall of the first day, 30,000 Marines were ashore. Kurabayashi counted the landing craft through his binoculars until he lost track. The Americans had established a beachhead, and their supply line was continuous. Ships lined up, waiting their turn to unload. "Sir," Lieutenant Tanaka reported, "we've destroyed 12 of their tanks, disabled perhaps 20 landing craft, and inflicted heavy casualties. But they keep coming. They replace losses faster than we can inflict them." Kurabayashi nodded grimly. This was exactly what he had feared. The American system of warfare was not about individual heroics or tactical brilliance. It was about overwhelming material superiority and the ability to sustain losses that would break any other nation. That night, Private Morrison and his gun crew on the Nevada fired illumination rounds, lighting up the battlefield so Marines could see Japanese counterattacks. Between rounds, Morrison could see the island clearly. Thousands of Marines were dug in, artillery was firing, tanks were positioned in defensive formations. The small beach had transformed into a military base in just 12 hours. How do we do it? Morrison wondered aloud. How do we move all this stuff so fast? His sergeant laughed. "Kid, you're looking at America right there. Every factory, every farm, every worker back home, they're all part of this. Those tanks came from Detroit. That ammunition was made in Pennsylvania. Those rations were packed in California. The whole country is fighting this war, and we're just the guys who deliver the package." For General Kurabayashi, that night was one of the darkest of his life. He walked through the tunnels, visiting his men. They were exhausted, traumatized, low on ammunition. Many were wounded. All of them knew they were facing something unprecedented. "General," a young soldier asked him, "will reinforcements come?" Kurabayashi wanted to lie, to give the boy hope. But he respected his men too much for that. "No. No reinforcements will come. The Americans control the sea and the air. We are alone." then we cannot win. We can make them pay dearly for this island, Kurabayashi replied. We can show them that Japanese soldiers do not surrender easily. But win? No. We cannot win. Not against this. He continued walking, and behind him, he heard the young soldier crying quietly. Kurabayashi understood. They had all been raised on stories of Japanese invincibility, of spirit overcoming material, of courage conquering technology. Now they faced the truth, and the truth was crushing. Over the next week, the battle intensified. Marines pushed forward yard by yard, taking terrible casualties. But for every American who fell, replacements arrived. For every tank destroyed, 2 more appeared. The Japanese defense was fierce, skilled, and brave, but it was being ground down by sheer industrial might. Captain Robert Miller from Chicago led his company in an assault on one of Kurabayashi's major defensive positions. They took 50% casualties taking the position, but Miller noticed something that struck him afterward. Inside the destroyed bunker, Japanese soldiers had perhaps 20 rounds of ammunition each. His Marines had landed with over 200 rounds per man, with unlimited resupply. They're fighting with empty rifles, Miller told his lieutenant. Half their weapons are out of ammunition. They're using bamboo spears. The lieutenant shook his head in disbelief. Bamboo spears against Shermans and flamethrowers. What were they thinking? But Miller understood. They weren't thinking anything. They're doing what they were ordered to do with what they have. It's not their strategy that's wrong. They never had enough to begin with. By the 10th day of battle, Kurabayashi's defense had been pushed back to Mount Suribachi and the island's northern caves. His artillery was mostly destroyed. His ammunition was running critically low. His men were starving because supply tunnels had been collapsed by bombing. But something happened on that 10th day that broke even Kurabayashi's iron composure. He was meeting with his remaining officers when Major Yoshida brought devastating news. Sir, reconnaissance reports that the Americans have established a working airfield on the southern beach. They landed construction equipment 3 days ago and have been working continuously. Aircraft are already taking off and landing. Kurabayashi stared at him. Impossible. The battle is still raging. We control half the island. Nevertheless, it is true. They built an operational airfield while fighting us. The construction crews worked under fire. Kurabayashi walked to the observation post and looked south. Through the smoke and dust, he could see it, a functioning airstrip on ground that had been a battlefield just days ago. American efficiency had turned war zone into infrastructure while combat still raged around them. This is what I tried to warn them about, Kurabayashi said quietly. This is why we could never win this war. They do not just fight with firepower. They fight with organization, logistics, and industrial capacity that we cannot comprehend. While we struggle to supply our soldiers with bullets, they build airports on battlefields. He turned to his officers, and for the first time, they saw tears in their general's eyes. Not from fear, but from the terrible understanding of what their nation had challenged. Gentlemen, I want you to understand what you are witnessing. This is not just a battle. This is the collision between an industrial superpower and a nation that thought spirit alone would be sufficient. And now you see the result. On February 23, 1945, the 14th day of battle, something happened that would become one of the most famous moments of World War II. Marines fought their way to the top of Mount Suribachi and raised an American flag. General Kurabayashi saw it through his binoculars from his command post in the northern caves. The small flag went up first. Then hours later, a larger one. His remaining officers gathered around him in silence, watching the symbol of their defeat flying over the mountain they had spent months fortifying. It is just a flag, Lieutenant Tanaka said quietly, trying to maintain morale. No, Kurabayashi replied. It is much more than that. It is a statement. They have taken our strongest position and claimed it for their nation. And they did it in 2 weeks. What haunted Kurabayashi most was not the loss of Suribachi itself, but how it fell. American Marines had attacked with flamethrower tanks, demolition teams, and constant artillery support. They had clearing teams that moved methodically from cave to cave. They had medical evacuation systems that removed wounded men and returned them to hospital ships within hours. They had everything: equipment, support, supplies, coordination. While his defenders had only courage and dwindling ammunition. Corporal Tommy Chen from San Francisco was part of the flag-raising patrol. His parents had immigrated from China, and he had joined the Marines to prove his American loyalty. Standing on top of Suribachi, looking down at the battlefield below, he was struck by the surreal contrast. "Look at our side," he said to his buddy, Mike O'Connor from Boston. "Supply dumps, vehicles everywhere, medical tents, communication lines. Now look at theirs, just holes in the ground and desperation." O'Connor nodded. "My dad fought in the First War. He told me about running out of ammunition, about supply problems, about chaos. This isn't like that at all. It's like organized destruction." "That's exactly what it is," Chen agreed. "We're not just better fighters. We're better at everything behind the fighting." In the northern caves, Kurabayashi's situation grew desperate. Water was contaminated. Food had run out days ago. Medical supplies were exhausted, leaving wounded men to suffer with no treatment. Ammunition was so low that he ordered his men to fix bayonets and prepare for close combat. But even in desperation, Kurabayashi continued to study his enemy. Every night, he sent scouts to observe American positions. What they reported back confirmed his worst understanding of American military power. "Sir," a scout sergeant reported, "the Americans have mobile kitchens. Their soldiers eat hot meals. They have tents for sleeping. They rotate units to rest. And sir, they have ice cream." "Ice cream," Major Yoshida repeated in disbelief. "Yes, sir. Ships dedicated to making ice cream for the troops. We watched them eating it." The officers fell silent. Their own men were starving, drinking contaminated water, dying of infected wounds. The Americans had ice cream. The contrast was so extreme it seemed like a cruel joke. But Kurabayashi understood what it really meant. "It is not about ice cream," he explained to his officers. "It is about a military system so efficient, so well supplied, that they can afford luxuries while fighting. It means their logistics are so superior that comfort items do not displace essential supplies. It means they have so much capacity that there is room for everything." On March 1st, Kurabayashi wrote his final report to Tokyo. His hand shook as he composed the message that would be his last official communication. To Imperial Headquarters, "The battle for Iwo Jima is lost. American firepower exceeded all estimates by factors of 10 or more. Their material superiority is absolute. I estimate they fired over 1 million shells at this small island. 1 million. Our entire defensive ammunition supply was perhaps 5,000 shells. We faced not just superior numbers, but a completely different category of warfare. Industrial warfare on a scale we cannot match. Every Japanese soldier fought with honor. But honor alone cannot stop steel and fire in such quantities. I die with my men, knowing we did our duty, but also knowing that we were sent to fight an enemy we were never equipped to resist." He paused, then added a final line. "If Japan continues this war, we face not just defeat, but annihilation. The Americans possess power beyond our comprehension." The radio operator encrypted the message and sent it. Kurabayashi would never know if Tokyo received it or understood it. Private First Class Eddie Rodriguez from New Mexico participated in the final assault on the northern caves. His platoon had taken heavy casualties throughout the battle, and Rodriguez himself had been wounded twice but refused evacuation. He wanted to finish what they had started. "Why do they keep fighting?" he asked his lieutenant as they prepared for another assault. "They have no supplies, no support, no hope. Why not surrender?" His lieutenant, a veteran of Guadalcanal, replied, "Because their code doesn't allow it. But also, think about what they've seen these past 3 weeks. We've thrown everything at them. Bombs, shells, flamethrowers, tanks. Maybe they figure dying in combat is better than whatever they think we'll do to prisoners." The final assault began on March 16th. By then, Kurabayashi had fewer than 300 effective soldiers left from his original 20,000-man garrison. They were out of ammunition, starving, and wounded. But they prepared one last counterattack, a night assault with bayonets and swords. Kurabayashi addressed his surviving men in the largest remaining cave. "Gentlemen, we have fought well. We have made the Americans pay for every foot of this island with blood. But now our duty is complete. We cannot win, but we can die as warriors. When I was in America, I learned to respect them. But I never stopped being Japanese. Tonight, we show them what that means." The counterattack came at 3 a.m. 300 desperate men, armed mostly with bladed weapons, charged American positions in complete silence. The shock was total. Hand-to-hand combat erupted across the American lines. Rodriguez found himself facing a Japanese officer wielding a sword. The man was emaciated, wounded, barely able to stand, but his eyes burned with determination. They fought briefly before Rodriguez's rifle ended it. Afterward, searching the officer's body for intelligence, Rodriguez found a letter. He couldn't read Japanese, but he took it anyway, along with the officer's sword. Years later, he would have the letter translated. It was from General Kurabayashi to his daughter, never sent, describing his love for her and his knowledge that he would not return home. Before we continue with how this battle ended and what the Japanese general said about American firepower afterward, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. We post real stories like this every week. Hit that like button if you're finding this fascinating. And here's a question for you. If you had been a Japanese soldier on Iwo Jima, watching American industrial power in action, what would have gone through your mind? Could anything have prepared you for what these men faced? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read them all and love hearing different perspectives. By dawn on March 17th, the counterattack was over. General Kurabayashi was dead, though his body was never found. His remaining officers had fallen in combat. The battle for Iwo Jima was finished after 36 days of fighting. But the story of what Japanese commanders said about American firepower was just beginning to emerge from captured documents, intercepted communications, and post-war interviews with survivors. What they revealed would shock even the American officers who had witnessed the battle firsthand. 3 months after the battle ended, American intelligence officers gathered in an office in occupied Tokyo. They had spent weeks translating captured Japanese documents, interrogating prisoners, and piecing together the enemy's perspective on American military power. What they discovered was both fascinating and sobering. Major Richard Patterson from Virginia led the intelligence team. He spread documents across a large table. Letters, reports, diary entries, all written by Japanese commanders throughout the Pacific Campaign. "Gentlemen," Patterson addressed his team, "what we're seeing here is a complete evolution in Japanese military thinking. At the start of the war, they believed spirit could overcome material. By the end, their own generals were trying desperately to warn Tokyo that they were facing something unprecedented." He picked up a letter written by Admiral Yamamoto in 1943, 2 years before Iwo Jima. Listen to this. "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant. The Americans we face now are not the same nation from 1941. They have transformed their entire society into a weapon. Every factory, every worker, every resource, all dedicated to our destruction. We calculated that our early victories would give us time. But time has become our enemy, because every month that passes, America grows stronger while we grow weaker." Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, a translator from California, held up another document. This one is from a supply officer on Guadalcanal. He writes, "American soldiers receive 3 hot meals daily. They have more ammunition than they can carry. When we capture their positions, we find abandoned supplies, food, medicine, equipment, all discarded because they have too much to transport. Meanwhile, our soldiers eat grass and tree bark. This is not a war of courage. This is a war of factories, and we have none that can compete." But the most revealing documents came from Iwo Jima itself. Patterson had obtained copies of General Kurabayashi's letters to Tokyo, including ones that had been suppressed by Japanese military censors who thought they were too defeatist. This one was written after the first day of the American bombardment. Patterson read aloud. Kurabayashi writes, "I have witnessed the true nature of American power today. It is not measured in the courage of their soldiers but in the output of their industry. They fired more shells at our positions in one day than our entire nation produces in a month. One battleship carries more ammunition than my entire garrison was allocated for the entire battle. How can we fight this? It is not a military question. It is a mathematical impossibility. The room fell silent. Even these American officers, who had seen the battle firsthand, were struck by the desperation in Kurabayashi's words. Across the Pacific, in a prisoner of war camp in the Philippines, Colonel Takechi Nishi sat with an American interviewer. Nishi was unusual. He had competed in the 1932 Olympics, spent time in America, and spoke fluent English. He had commanded tank units on Iwo Jima and survived the battle, one of the few senior officers to do so. You want to know what we thought of American firepower? Nishi said to the interviewer, Captain James Donovan from New York. I will tell you honestly. We thought the reports were exaggerated. When we were told that America produced thousands of aircraft per month, we thought it was propaganda. When we heard about your industrial output, we told ourselves it was impossible. And then, Donovan prompted. And then we experienced it, Nishi continued, his voice heavy. On Iwo Jima, I commanded 14 tanks. Old tanks, poorly maintained, with limited ammunition. On the first day of your invasion, I counted over 100 American tanks coming ashore. 100. And that was just the beginning. By the end of the first week, you had more tanks on that small island than our entire army had in all of Japan. He paused, staring at his hands. But it was not just the numbers. It was the system. Your tanks broke down? You had mechanics and spare parts immediately. They ran out of fuel? Tanker trucks appeared within an hour. Your crew was wounded? Medics evacuated them and replacement crews arrived. Everything worked together like a machine. We had nothing like that. When my tank broke down, it stayed broken. When my men were wounded, they died because we had no medicine. Donovan scribbled notes furiously. Did you communicate this to your superiors? Every day, Nishi replied. I sent reports explaining that we were not fighting an army. We were fighting an industrial empire. But Tokyo did not want to hear it. Admitting the truth meant admitting that the war was unwinnable. So they told us to fight harder, to believe in our spirit, to trust in victory. But you cannot defeat mathematics with spirit. Back in Tokyo, Major Patterson's team discovered perhaps the most damning document of all. A secret report compiled by Japanese military analysts in early 1945, just before the Iwo Jima invasion. The report had been suppressed immediately and never distributed beyond a handful of senior commanders. Lieutenant Mitchell translated key sections aloud. American industrial capacity analysis reveals the following. Aircraft production, approximately 96,000 units in 1944 alone. Our production for the same year, 28,000 units. Naval construction. America commissioned over 100 major warships in 1944. We commissioned 7. Ammunition production. America produces more artillery shells in 1 week than we produce in 6 months. Steel production. America exceeds our entire annual output in less than 2 months. She looked up from the document. The report concludes with this. Based on current production rates and material analysis, Japan cannot sustain a war of attrition against the United States. Every battle, even if tactically successful, represents a strategic defeat because American losses can be replaced while ours cannot. Recommendation. Seek negotiated peace immediately before complete industrial collapse makes any negotiation impossible. They knew, Patterson said quietly. By early 1945, their own analysts knew they couldn't win. But the report was classified as defeatist and buried. The most haunting testimony came from a young Japanese lieutenant named Hiroshi Yamada, who survived Iwo Jima and was interviewed in 1946. He had been 22 years old during the battle, a graduate of Japan's military academy, indoctrinated in the belief of Japanese superiority. I will tell you the moment I understood we had lost the war, Yamada told his American interviewer. It was not when the Marines landed. It was not during the fighting. It was on the third day, when the bombardment paused briefly. I looked out from our cave and saw your ships on the horizon. And then I saw something that broke my spirit completely. What was it? The interviewer asked. A ship was damaged, I think by one of our artillery shells. Not badly damaged, but it was smoking. And as I watched, 2 other ships came alongside it. Within an hour, they had repaired it and it was firing again. You could repair warships during battle. We could barely repair a truck in peacetime. That is when I knew. You had so much equipment, so much capability, so much of everything that losing one ship meant nothing. You could fix it and keep fighting. We could not replace anything. Every loss was permanent. He paused, then added, General Kurabayashi tried to warn us before the battle. He told us we were facing a nation that had turned its entire economy into a war machine. He said we would see things that seemed impossible. He was right. Everything about American firepower was impossible by our standards. Impossible amounts of ammunition. Impossible numbers of weapons. Impossible speed of repair and resupply. We were fighting not just an army, but an entire civilization dedicated to winning. Major Patterson compiled all these testimonies and documents into a classified report titled Enemy Assessment of American Industrial Warfare: The Japanese Perspective. The report's conclusion was stark. Japanese military commanders, at virtually every level and in every theater, came to understand that they were fighting a war they could not win. Not due to lack of courage or tactical skill, but due to absolute material inferiority. American firepower, backed by unmatched industrial capacity, created a form of warfare that Japanese doctrine had no answer for. By 1945, captured documents and prisoner interviews reveal that most Japanese officers privately acknowledged defeat was inevitable. Yet the war continued for months more, costing hundreds of thousands of additional lives. The report ended with a quote from General Kurabayashi's final message: American firepower is not merely superior, it is categorically different. We prepared for a war of soldiers. They brought a war of factories. There is no honor in this observation, no shame in admitting it. It is simply mathematical reality. One American factory produces more weapons in a month than our entire nation can produce in a year. How do you fight that? You cannot. Patterson closed the report and looked at his team. These men fought bravely. They died for their country. But they died knowing they were facing something their entire military system was never designed to handle. And the tragedy is that their leaders knew it too. But by the time they fully understood, it was far too late to change course. As the interviews and document analysis continued through 1946, a picture emerged of an enemy who had learned the truth about American power but could not act on that truth. Japanese generals wrote privately about the impossibility of victory. Junior officers reported the overwhelming nature of American firepower. Soldiers in their final letters home described facing weapons and supplies in quantities that seemed to violate the laws of nature. But perhaps the most telling moment came during an interview with a Japanese general who had planned defensive operations across the Pacific. When asked what surprised him most about fighting America, he replied simply, "Nothing surprised me. General Kurabayashi told us exactly what we would face. We just could not believe him until we saw it ourselves. And by then, it was too late." The war ended on August 15, 1945, after atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the lessons of Iwo Jima and the reality of American firepower had already been learned by every Japanese commander who survived to see that day. In October 1945, American officers conducted a final series of interviews with Japan's highest-ranking military leaders. These men, who had planned and executed Japan's war strategy, were now prisoners facing war crimes trials. For the first time, they spoke openly about what they had known and when they had known it. General Hideki Tojo, who had been prime minister during most of the war, sat across from his interrogators in Sugamo prison. Major Patterson was among those questioning him. The once powerful leader looked diminished in prison clothing, but his mind remained sharp. "General Tojo," Patterson began, "when did you first understand that Japan could not match American industrial production?" Tojo was silent for a long moment. Then he replied, "I knew before the war began. Admiral Yamamoto knew. Many of us knew. America's industrial capacity was documented, published, undeniable. We calculated that your steel production alone was 10 times ours. Your oil production was hundreds of times greater. The mathematics were clear. Then why did you proceed with the war? Because we believed, or we told ourselves we believed, that spirit could overcome material. That a quick series of victories would force negotiation before your industrial power could be fully mobilized. That you lacked the will to sustain a long war. He shook his head slowly. We were wrong about everything except the industrial numbers. Those were accurate. And those numbers destroyed us. Patterson showed him photographs from Iwo Jima, the beaches covered with American equipment, the supply dumps, the ships stretching to the horizon. What went through your mind when you received reports like this? Terror, Tojo admitted quietly. Pure terror. Because these images confirmed what we had feared. You had transformed your entire nation into a weapon. Every factory, every farm, every worker, all focused on producing war material. And you did it so quickly. In 1941, you were unprepared. By 1943, you were unstoppable. The speed of American industrial mobilization exceeded even our worst predictions. In another cell, Admiral Somu Toyoda, who had commanded Japan's navy in the final years of the war, spoke with similar candor. At Iwo Jima, we lost 20,000 men defending 8 square miles. You lost 7,000 taking it. By the mathematics of warfare, we inflicted significant casualties. But what did it matter? Within weeks, you replaced every loss. You sent those fallen Marines home with honor and shipped replacement soldiers from training camps that graduated thousands monthly. We could not replace our losses. Each man who died on Iwo Jima was gone forever. He leaned forward, his voice intense. Do you understand what that means? You could afford to lose. Every battle, even if tactically successful for us, was strategically meaningless because your capacity to absorb losses and continue fighting was infinite compared to ours. General Kurabayashi understood this. He designed his defense not to win, but to make victory so expensive you might negotiate. But even that failed because you could afford the expense. Lieutenant Mitchell interviewed a junior officer named Captain Masaru Yoshida, who had served on Kurabayashi's staff and survived by being captured while unconscious from wounds. He had spent months in American hospitals and was struck by what he observed. The hospital ship that treated me had better medical equipment than our finest hospital in Tokyo, Yoshida told her. The food was better than what I ate as an officer in peacetime. The Americans guarding us, they were eating steaks, fresh vegetables, drinking Coca-Cola. Meanwhile, our civilians were starving and our soldiers had eaten the last rats on Iwo Jima. He pulled out a small notebook he had kept hidden throughout his captivity. I made observations. American supply ships arrived daily. I counted. Your logistics system delivered over 2 million tons of supplies to Pacific Islands in 1945 alone. 2 million tons. Our entire merchant fleet at its peak could not carry that much in a year. And your submarines had sunk most of our ships anyway. What did General Kurabayashi say about this? Mitchell asked. He said we were samurai facing machine guns. That our code of honor was beautiful but our industrial base was pathetic. He said, and I wrote this down because it struck me, the Americans have discovered how to mass-produce courage. They manufacture brave soldiers the same way they manufacture tanks. Not through tradition or training alone, but by giving every soldier such overwhelming support that being brave becomes practical rather than suicidal. Back in the United States, the military was conducting its own analysis of the Pacific Campaign. Secretary of War Henry Stimson reviewed the reports on Iwo Jima with a mixture of pride and sobering awareness. We lost 7,000 Marines taking that island, he told his staff. 7,000 young men. But our commanders tell me that if we had fought with Japanese supply levels, we would have lost 40,000. Our industrial power didn't just give us victory, it saved American lives. Sergeant Bill Hayes, who had survived Iwo Jima, returned home to Brooklyn in late 1945. He was invited to speak at his old high school about the war. Standing before auditorium full of students, he struggled to explain what he had witnessed. You kids learn about battles in history class, Hayes said. You learn about brave generals and tactical genius. But Iwo Jima wasn't won by tactics. It was won by factories. It was won by the men and women who built ships in Brooklyn Navy Yard, who welded tanks in Detroit, who packed ammunition in Pennsylvania, who grew food in Iowa. Every single person in America was part of our firepower. He paused, remembering. The Japanese soldiers we fought were brave. Braver than brave. They fought with almost nothing. No food, no water, no ammunition, and they still fought. But courage can't stop steel. Spirit can't block artillery shells. And eventually, they learned what their generals already knew. America wasn't just a country fighting a war. America was a machine designed to win wars, and once that machine started running, nothing could stop it. Private Morrison, the young sailor from Ohio who had loaded shells on the USS Nevada, visited the Iwo Jima Memorial after the war. Looking at the famous photograph of the flag raising, he thought about something his sergeant had told him. That flag represents 6 men, the sergeant had said. But those 6 men were supported by millions. Every American who built a ship, grew food, mined, or transported supplies, worked in a factory. They all raised that flag together. That's what the Japanese never understood until it was too late. They thought they were fighting our military. They were fighting our entire civilization. By 1946, historians were already analyzing what had happened. The consensus was clear. Japan had entered a war they mathematically could not win, against an enemy whose industrial capacity was so superior that the outcome was never truly in doubt once American production reached full capacity. The final word perhaps belongs to the man who understood it first. Among General Kurabayashi's papers, discovered after the war, was a letter he had written to a fellow officer in 1943, 2 years before Iwo Jima. I have walked through American cities, Kurabayashi wrote. I have seen their factories operate. I have driven their highways and observed their infrastructure. And I tell you with absolute certainty, we cannot defeat them in a war of production. They have more of everything. More steel, more oil, more food, more workers, more land, more resources. More importantly, they have systems, organization, efficiency, the ability to coordinate millions of people toward a single goal. The letter continued, if we fight America in the way we have trained to fight, through courage, discipline, and warrior spirit, we will lose. Not because our soldiers are inferior, but because they will face an enemy with 10 bullets for every one of ours, 10 shells for every one we fire, 10 tanks for every one we field. How do you win that war? You cannot. The mathematics forbid it. He concluded with words that proved prophetic. I fear that by the time our leaders understand this truth, it will be too late. We will have committed ourselves to a war we cannot win, and many brave men will die learning what we should have known from the start. In modern warfare, spirit alone is not enough. You need steel. You need oil. You need factories. And America has these things in quantities we cannot match. When this war comes, and I believe it will come, we will learn this lesson at a terrible cost. Kurabayashi died on Iwo Jima, along with nearly all of his men. But his words survived. And in those words lies the truth that Japanese generals finally spoke after it was too late. American firepower was not just superior, it was an entirely different category of warfare, backed by an industrial system that turned an entire nation into a weapon. The Battle of Iwo Jima lasted 36 days. But the lesson it taught about industrial warfare, about the power of organized production, about the futility of courage without material support, that lesson echoes through history. If this story opened your eyes to a side of World War II you never learned in school, do us a favor. Subscribe to this channel, smash that like button, and share this video with anyone who loves real history. Drop a comment below telling us what shocked you most about this story. Was it the scale of American firepower? The bravery of the Japanese soldiers fighting with almost nothing? Or the fact that Japanese generals knew they couldn't win but fought anyway? We want to hear your thoughts. And remember, history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about understanding how the world works. The men who fought on Iwo Jima on both sides taught us that in modern war, victory goes not just to the brave, but to those who can support their bravery with the output of their entire nation. Thank you for watching. Honor the memory of all who fought by learning their stories and sharing their lessons. Because the greatest tribute to those who experienced war is ensuring that future generations understand what they went through and why it happened. Never forget.